Welcome to Animistic, where we explore cutting-edge innovations in animal nutrition and sustainable farming. Don't miss our content. Hit play and join us in transforming the future of pets and livestock in the agribusiness.
Well, welcome to this conversation about insect production. This has been a hot topic for us at Animistic over the last couple of years, and the research is growing day by day. The accessibility to insects for food is also growing, and I thought it would be a good time to discuss it further. And really kind of stemming from why were we looking at insects as the next protein source for food is because obviously we need to increase our food production by 70 to 100% because of the rising population by 2050. But we have to do that with less land, less resources. And so insect protein, since they are kind of like a garbage disposal of the world, really is a good alternative. But they're going to have to be farmed. Normally, we try to rid the environment of these pesky creatures, and now we're learning to farm them similar to what we do with dogs and cats. And they take very little space compared to a cow, for instance, and less water use. When we look at it from a EU perspective, we've approved insects for fish in 2017 and then swine and poultry consumption in 2021. But our guest is going to explain the UK still has some regulatory hurdles to overcome where it is being used as an everyday treat for chickens in the USA. Our guest speaker is Clayton Payne. He is the COO of the Bug Factory, and he has Pet Disruptors podcast, which is a must-to listen. He has a variety of experts and guests, content not always about pets, but also about insect production. But he is leading a large-scale insect farming initiative and making it more cheaper to have insects as protein sources for animal and pet nutrition. The Bug Factory is exactly kind of what in his description is a large-scale insect farming. They're looking at rearing the bugs and making a sustainable and affordable protein source for the pet and animal space. And now let's welcome our guest speaker, Clayton. Well, welcome, Clayton, to the interview here about insect production. I have been following you now for a few months, loving your content and loving to learn more about what you and the Bug Factory is doing to raise insects.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks so much for connecting with me and bringing me on this. I love talking about what we're doing in the insect space, and it's definitely an industry which has got a lot of capital and a lot of desire behind it. But it's one as well which has got a lot of challenges to it, and there's a lot of smoke and mirrors around it as well. So it's really my sort of role I see is to try and dispel as much of that and actually make economic black soldier fly larvae, which can actually economically compete with traditional protein sources, which is something it hasn't been doing up until this point.
Can you give the audience a little bit of a background, because you have a very unique and interesting path to becoming a COO of raising insects?
Yeah, so my background is my parents had a pet store when I was a kid, and I grew up more or less in a pet store. So I've obviously been obsessed with it my whole life. I worked for a number of manufacturers growing up, and then me and a friend of mine, we started a pet distribution business in the southeast of the UK, and we built that from a small company to a national company, distributing, I would say, mainly wild bird food products, but also things like natural dog treats. And we were innovators in those spaces because we took the wholesale model, which was quite a sort of a decrepit, unprofitable model, and we added a lot of profitability to it through innovating on new products. Then fast forward to the end of that, I decided I was dead in my boots after all that time of doing the same thing. And we sold the business, and I went back to university, did my master's degree in development economics, wrote some environmental paperwork, and then decided to get more involved with the insect side of things. But I was also doing consultancy as well at the same time for different brands, working with a lot of startups, but a lot of scale ups as well. But then I said, right, insects is something I believe in, but I also look at it and I say it doesn't make sense in the format it's in at the moment. So it was really, creating a business which made economic sense. And actually, I know we bang on about sustainability all the time, but actually, there's nothing sustainable if you're not selling anything. You can have the most sustainable thing in the world, but if no one's buying it, you're not being sustainable because you're not actually changing customer behavior. So it was creating a product that could actually feasibly change customer behavior.
Well, I really love that, because before the whole world adopted sustainability and turned it around greenhouse gas emissions, I've had that in my resume as my objective, right? Sustainable agriculture. And to me, growing up in agriculture, I've looked at it like a full cycle. And, I worked with crops growing up, and then pig farming. And then, I was one of the first to take a nutrient management course program where we could be nutrient management planners if we wanted to be, and kind of just full circle of everything. And growing up on the swine farm, we used to feed leftover cereal, and our best day was when we got candy bars in and Snickers. So you can imagine we'd run out and try to find some good ones to the pigs. So it's kind of, when we look at this food waste and sustainability, I've always been passionate about it. And I do really believe insects is the next area. We do look at agriculture in general. The general population doesn't understand that a lot of the food waste, which is quite a bit from human food production, livestock eat today. And we can't eliminate livestock because we'd be putting all that waste back into the landfills. But if we can't get over the fact that we want to eat pigs and chickens and cows, and we can eat insects for protein, I think, long term, that insect market can also maybe even take on more human food waste than we can get rid of in the animal production field.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about like food waste going to animal production, because I think there's a basic misconception around what food waste is. And people talk about, like, insect companies are one of the worst for doing it. We are always saying we turn waste food into protein, but the reality is there's the waste food in Europe, which is actually being landfilled like 90% of the time, is actually not allowed to be fed to insects because it contains animal byproducts. So the actual competition for what they call waste, which might be brewers' grains, or let's say waste pasta at a food factory, or let's say waste vegetables, for example, from agriculture. Most of these things are already going into animal livestock food anyway. So you end up, the danger is that you sort of gloss over the real sustainability of insects by competing on things that are going into animal food anyway. So all you're doing is putting more pressure on those streams. So when we look to do it in a sustainable manner, we actually have to say, right, okay, what isn't being used effectively? And look, we have, I don't know about the US, but over here we have a big boom in anaerobic digestion as well. So energy production through dumping waste through things. So most manures, for example, or human, let's say, kitchen bin waste, that will all go into an anaerobic digestion plant and be turned into energy. So it will create methane. That methane will then be converted into energy. So when we look at like true sustainability, we have to be very careful that what we don't do is we don't just say, well, let's just compete for products which are already sort of destined for the livestock food industry, because then we're creating livestock food from livestock food. And I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound very sustainable to me, to be honest.
Well, no, and if you look at it, if that's the approach the insect production market or farming wants to take, is you are centuries behind us on how to utilize those byproducts in a nutrition program. And I've been involved on the outskirts of watching EnviroFlight with Darling grow. I mean, Darling's been one of those waste stream byproduct companies here in the US for a long time that sells different products or reuses kitchen grease and things like that into animal food production. So they invested very early on into insect production. And I was a customer. We're not buying grubs anymore, but they were my supplier for grubs when we had a line of that for the backyard poultry market. But they found early on, if they're really going to use insects for all their value, is it's not what people think of just feeding them. I can put them on manure and make insects, yes. But they really had to tailor those diets to get the exact oils, the exact protein sources they wanted to be a viable and economic product that I would in turn want to use either in the human nutrition for some of those oils and cosmetics, or on the food side to produce animal feed, I guess, or pet food as well. And so it's not just as simple as a lot of people think. And I mean, I love innovators like you. And then, you talked about the soldier fly group that started out with an insect producer for reptiles in the US on your podcast. And I love hearing about all these different companies coming out and kind of what is the status of insect production in your mind, and where are we at today, and where do we need to go to? Are we going to compete with livestock protein, or are we going to displace some of that, or are we going to add benefits to that industry?
So, in my mind, I think so. For example, I think like the gold standard everyone looks at when they talk about replacing things is actually replacing soy. But I think the only way we can actually do that effectively is by creating real value streams for the other products. So, for example, the oil. The oil is very, very useful. It's full of medium chain fatty acids, which, like lauric acid, which have a huge amount of benefits, especially in like animals in terms of immune response, in terms of like by looking after the body, like regulating things. Inflammation, that sort of stuff. And the protein almost has to be a bit of a byproduct to actually really compete in the animal food sector. And at the moment, everything's on its head a little bit because they're sort of valuing the protein more than they're valuing, let's say, the oil or the frass, like the which is the the mixture of like their poop and the chitin, which is created during production. And actually, it's so like the way I liken the industry is the problem in the industry at the moment is there's not enough scale. And so the way I liken it is like the dairy farmer. If I have one cow in a field and I just milk it, what have I got? I've just got milk. But if I have 1,000 cows and I serve a dairy which has 1,000 customers with something similar, there's a lot of products we can make. Like, so you can make chitin effectively, you can create chitosan. There's lots of medical uses for these products. There's lots of other value chains, and really we have to, as an industry, stop seeing the protein as being the sort of one of the most economic things, when in reality it's the milk of the milk industry. It has to be looked at as something which we create as a bottom standard against something like soy. But in the sort of short to medium terms, before we get to scale, we have to really take every other market on the way. And so obviously the pet food market, there's a lot of benefits for the dog food market. There's a huge amount of work we can do within the wild bird food market. But then also in aquaculture, there's a lot of benefits in agriculture, because obviously there's a global shortage of fish meal. We're not producing enough. And when we talk about poor sustainability, I think fish meal like production is about as bad as it gets. But what they're using is, plant-based proteins and stuff like chicken meal in the UK to feed the fish on. And
And they have
So
massive disease issues and mortality by feeding those products to fish.
exactly. Whereas black soldier fly is a much more natural product. So we can, if we can create a product which makes sense on an economic scale for those guys, that's our route to market and route to expansion, and really to value strip the black soldier fly as much as we can. But obviously, the way we're actually doing it currently has to change.
And I was going to say the protein profile of black soldier flies is a very strong protein source. I know we want to compare it to soy, and I think it can compete every day if we get the price right. But like you said, I even evaluated it. Darling was looking at moving their waste product that you call the frass, right? The waste, and the leftover byproducts that the insects grew on. There was huge value in that, of just a fiber component from our aspect of feeding a insoluble type fiber, potentially for some of the, so I work with rabbits and I work with swine, and scale today, looking at an R&D platform for that in swine wouldn't be effective because you couldn't produce enough. Like one herd, I could feed it all out in a year. But with rabbits, it was a lot more viable option. Hopefully someday I'll get that trial to go here with my rabbits, but we haven't got it done yet. But there is tons of value through that whole chain, and I think that's really important to talk about. And what's even interesting is a European company, Protix, and Tyson announcing here in my town that they're partnering on a massive facility here in Arkansas to take poultry litter and grow insects. I do have some concerns on the quality of insect that they'll grow, from the standpoint of the manure is what the bird did not need to grow. So if we're going to grow those insects to feed back to our bird, will we be feeding it a subpar protein or oil composition? But it'd be really interesting to see how that plays out. I think there's some, really good excitement around here. I still don't know, in my lifetime, you talked about on one of your podcasts, the grossness of eating insects. Like that will become a thing that instead of having a hamburger or an Impossible Burger made from soy, we'll eat an insect Impossible Burger, but who knows?
Yeah, and I've got to be honest, I've eaten insects and I won't be changing anytime soon, to be honest, because they taste awful. So that's my personal 2 cents on it.
I have swallowed enough flies on accident that I will not be changing my diet either.
Yeah, so when people come at me and say I'm being paid by the WEF, I can tell you, like, I'm not advocating for people eating insects at all, to be honest. So, but it's funny you were saying about chicken litter, and I think that one of the biggest problems we have as an industry is also consistency of feed to the black soldier fly, because as you said earlier, it's important to have like a nutritional balance. And if I'm serving a dog food company, let's say I'm serving Jiminy's in the US with a black soldier fly product, what I can't do is feed it on potatoes and brewer's grains today and then chicken litter tomorrow, because the consistency is going to be completely different. The nutritional analysis is going to be completely different, and they'd have to change their packaging on a weekly basis as a result. So doing that economically is also very important, which is why what we're doing is looking at large scale products which are currently of no use to AD, of no use to animal feed, and then supplementing that with what we need to in terms of other, let's say, products which may be in the competing space to actually produce a consistent feed, so that we can actually economically grow it in a scalable way.
We discussed a lot off screen in your conversations. I mean, it's very academic today. It's not massive scale, but there's a lot of players starting up in this, and not to mention some of them have ignored me when I've reached out to ask them I could help promote the product or work with on developing more. But what is in your mind, you're leading a company that's really active in the space and hopefully going to change the possibility of having insect protein at an affordable price for animal. I'm going to say animal feed today. Someday we may say animal or human food. But on the the aquaculture side, what are we lacking to go next? Because I mean, looking at this industry from the last 10 years, it's grown a lot. And I'll use an example on my grub supply. You know, EnviroFlight was the only US based grub manufacturer I could buy soldier flies for, and that was a thing that we wanted. We didn't want Chinese sourced grubs because they were grown on litter. We wanted a uniform, our manure or chicken litter and things, and we wanted a really high nutritious treat for our chickens that we were selling. So that was really important to us. But since I even went into that project, there's 5 or 6 producers now that I can buy from in the US, and that's in a 3-year span. What's it going to take to really say that you can supply the Tysons or the Smithfield or, you know, CPs of the world for, you know, aquaculture? You know, Trout Nutraco is another big aqua feed manufacturer. What is it going to take to get us from where we are today to that main ingredient for, let's just say, aquaculture?
So my big bugbear with what's happening at the moment is that at the moment the industry isn't economic and it survives on investor-led money and grants, etc. Like the sort of really sort of paying into the potential of the product. And as a result, what we're seeing a lot of companies producing product which is far too high in price for industry, like far too high in price. And the companies that are there's a hell of a lot of companies, but they're all, if you can imagine like the value chain of equipment, breeding, and then there's like rearing technology, and then there's product manufacture and sales. And you need that whole value chain to actually be a functioning whole. What we're finding in the industry is everybody is front loaded into the first part. So everybody's creating really like wild and wacky machinery, wild and wacky like regulation systems, neonate counters, breeding facilities. Then you have some which are making rearing stuff, but it's like everybody's obsessed with IP as well. So it's like, well, my box that I create black soldier fly in, I get an extra 5% yield because I do something absolutely bizarre with it. And it's loads and loads of that. Well, actually, what we need is, we don't need any of this stuff. What we need is to stop thinking like tech companies and start thinking like agricultural companies. And this is obviously where my point of difference is that I see this as, look, if we created, one thing I say is, if we created eggs, like chicken eggs, in an AI factory full of like wild and wacky sensors and robotic arms, how much would an egg be by the time it hit the supermarket? It would be unaffordable. No one would buy them. But we actually need to create an agricultural based system which creates products which we can actually then valorize economically through the market to get scale. Because there's no point me creating a ton of black soldier fly protein for $4,000 a ton, because when I go to sell it to the guy who's selling chicken meal, and he's selling it for $1,000 a ton, because chickens used in the chicken meal production are usually end of life layers with virtually no value, which aren't going to go into the human food chain anyway. Why would he buy it? Because the gap is way too big. We need to close that gap, and the only way we can close it is through using very basic, very agricultural means. And so our whole production method is really based on, obviously, my knowledge of creating warehouses, creating the agricultural buildings, and using basic machinery that you can find anywhere. So forklift trucks, not robotic arms, like a forklift truck with a guy on it, unloading pallet bins, which you can tip into an actual sieve, and then bag it up simply, dispatch and carry on, and making it like you would any other agricultural product. Whereas if you go to, I would say 95% of the companies which have the money in the system, they're really creating systems which are, very high tech, very, very fancy. And, the other thing is as well, is like does a farm need a CFO and a COO and a CTO and a PCSO or whatever else? They're overloading with high level jobs, when realistically a farm should have a farm manager, an operations guy, and some laborers. And that's how you make money from it, and that's how we push it forward. And it's only the central people who actually then do something with the product, produce the products that you can then afford a little bit more fat on the actual economic model of.
So if I'm hearing you right, which I love this to say that us farmers may know something about raising protein, but it's where the money's coming from. And we look at the software, the Silicon Valley, the venture capital money, where they're getting this. The one, startup I was looking at, out in Seattle and stuff, and not a traditional ag-based state in that region. But when we look at that kind of money, they want very high turnover of, investing in companies. And that's why I have never went after venture capital, because I want to do what's right, not what's going to make you the most money the fastest. But if I'm hearing you right, you think a lot of these companies will just probably fizzle out or get bought out because they have nice margins, but they don't have scalability or volume to grow past that basic margin structure they're looking at today.
I think a lot of them are relying on scale of economic markets that don't make sense. If I'm honest, so for example, the big insect producing companies like Protix, etc., they're relying on the explosion in the pet industry. Now, if you were to take a graph model and say, well, the industry rose by 600% year on year, well, that's fine, but it's coming from a base of nothing to what we have now, which is still just above nothing. So it's kind of, these projections don't really work out in reality. But again, because it's all IP driven by VCs who want 10x their investment at 5 years down the line, that they're also focused on making sure that what they do is significantly different. And they're not really thinking about, okay, when you say to them, look, fish meal, in the UK, it's about £1,400 a ton for fish meal, and black soldier fly meal is like £3,000 a ton. And you say to them, well, okay, it's not even like for like, because fish meal is 70% protein, black soldier fly meal is 58% protein if you're lucky, and so it's not even like for like. It's not even worth as much as fish meal to fish companies. So
when you look at soybean meal on that, and fish meal companies will tolerate a 40% mortality feeding a $400 protein source compared to even the $1,200. That's why that plays in, that they're not feeding fish meal, right? So that's, I'm totally agreeing with you. It's unreasonable to think to eat, and they also think, oh, well, it's going to be human food and people are going to buy it because they want something different than animal meat. And you can see a lot of these legislation going on with laboratory grown meat. You can see legislation, labeling things, and a lot of these, fake meats or different things that we talk about going under a lot of those startups. We look at vertical farming. People who have tried to scale that have kind of failed as well. And a lot of venture capital in going to what you said, this tech. Well, it's got to be all fancy and systems and tech, and people will pay our margin because we're more sustainable. Like, we're the new cool thing, and it's not the reality of agriculture and food production.
I mean, the reality of like retail as well, and also for fish food companies, is that nobody pats them on the back for sustainability. Like, nobody actually says to, let's say Skretting, who are a fish food company, and says to them, well done, that was more sustainable. Like, you've lost money now on your product because you've put black soldier fly meal in, but well done. Like, nobody says that. The reality is they work on tight margins. They can't afford to buy, more expensive product to put into their foods because they're not the end user. And so even at the end user side of it, if I'm a supermarket, let's say, selling products, I've already got products which I claim as sustainable, because the problem with sustainability as a word is it's very broad and it doesn't really mean anything. And what is, how do we know that this is more sustainable than that is more sustainable than that? I can say sustainable, but what does that really mean? And the problem is with consumers is they're kind of a bit like, they've heard too much of it at this point, and so
Yeah,
when we
the
go,
most sustainable agriculture protein production is aquaculture. They're using the water that they naturally grow in. They're not using land mass besides the food that they grow on, and they have the best feed conversion. And so, but with that, they have to be the lowest cost too. And that's where $3,000 a metric ton, or even $1,200 a metric ton for fish meal, just does not play right.
Yeah. And so that's where we're at. And so realistically, that's why I say the protein itself has to become a way less valuable part of the chain, because we need to valorize every single part of production and produce it more agriculturally in a much more economic fashion, and be a little bit less perfectionist about what we're doing. Because again, I think there's always that, can we produce the most nutritionally complete, rather than let's go 95%, but let's really carve the price down, to be honest, So yeah, it's something I complain about on a daily basis.
Well, let's get off of sustainability. Obviously, I think people know how we feel about that and how we're using it. But basically, it's cost, guys. It's cost, and you got to compete with what we're already using, if not better, for us to even give you a glance. Besides on an academic look and see, right? But let's move over like regulatory. Obviously, in agriculture, and I'm going to keep insects, we're talking as an agriculture issue. We have a lot of regulations going on changing agriculture today, from the dairy, poultry, swine producers, like our main proteins today. Where do you feel like regulatory around the world is going to play into insect production for the future?
So the regulatory thing is something, again, I talk about a lot. So in the UK, as you know, like, you can't give dried insects to chickens at the moment, to poultry, because it goes back to the Chinese production and the fear of product like soldier fly or insects raised on bio-waste being fed into the human food chain. But when we talk, so at the moment in the UK, we have a lot of regulatory things we're working on in terms of feeding. There's reports being done by FERA, which is part of DEFRA. Well, it's part owned by DEFRA, on using things like manures, etc. But my personal angle on the regulatory thing is that so one of my favorite, what I say to people is, we don't have like speed limiters in the sky for flying cars at the moment. We can make flying cars, but no one uses them. And this is the problem. There's no scale to the industry. So it's very hard to push regulations when there's nothing really being produced at scale. So if we're producing 100 tons of something a year or 500 tons of something a year, it's very hard to get in front of people and say, well, actually, if we deregulate it for this, it would increase the industry. But if we're producing thousands and thousands of tons a year, it gives us, as an industry, a bit more push for regulation. Because look, regulators have a lot of different stuff going on. And why would they really spend a lot of time on something which hasn't really developed any major scale, because it doesn't make sense in the current marketplace? So that's kind of where I see the regulation. I see it changing, but I only see it changing with scale, and with us actually, as an industry, sharpening up and actually producing something which is economic and has a market fit to it.
Well, cool. I know we've talked a lot about economics, but what is it going to take for the pet industry and pet owners to value products made with insects when they freak out about corn being in their diets, or different grains, and all these different, diversions and types of products we have out there because of misinformation? What is it going to take, that acceptability, or will it just be in unique, out of the world, fringe type diets or economic diets, do you think, for the pet industry to really adopt insect protein?
So here's the thing, so at the moment, so I know all the different insect dog food producers that are currently based in the UK, and something I'm at them about all the time is that their marketing is wrong. Their marketing, how they position the product, is completely wrong. It makes no sense. It will die. It will die. It's a slow death the way they're doing it. So at the moment, the main two sales funnels they use in terms of USPs is sustainability and hypoallergenicity, both of which, in my opinion, are nonsense terms that mean nothing to anybody and are so vague that nobody buys on that basis. What we actually need to be doing is actually looking at the real benefits behind insect protein and selling that. So selling the fact that the lauric acid in black soldier 40% higher than the normal animal protein, and lauric acid is phenomenally beneficial. It's phenomenally beneficial for joints, for immune system.
Immune system. I mean, viral control that we're using it for in swine.
100%. So that's what we need to be pushing. And now look, whether or not that ends up being a insect only based dog food, or whether companies adopt 10 to 15% rations inside of standard protein dog foods, I'm kind of agnostic to that. But I think as an industry, we really need to be selling on pain points, because there's nobody goes into a shop and says, you know what, I want a sustainable food. Well, look up there's 15 types. And we don't know how sustainable any of them are. Some sound more sustainable than others, but those customers don't really exist anyway. Or if they do, they appear in such small scales and in such tiny pockets of the country that it's not a market you should really be going after. Whereas if we can actually address people's problems, so if you've got an older dog, having a dog food with natural lauric acid in, which already is part of the protein, so it's easily digested, that makes a lot of sense. And that's what we should be pushing, and that's what we as an industry need to be pushing in through the pet industry to actually make it make sense, because our current sales marketing structures in the UK are nonsense. I do think, look, just on the side thing, I do know that Jiminy's are doing a much better job in the US than any UK company, in my opinion, in terms of how they're promoting and positioning their products. And I know they do a huge amount of research on actual health benefits. And I do believe they are completely in the right, because in the UK and Europe, we're completely misguided. And I call it the domino effect, that somebody comes up with a product, they mark out the USPs. Everybody from that point who copies those same USPs until none of it makes sense anymore, and we're all just doing the same thing. So I do think that's where it is. But I'd like to see a lot more combined protein diets with insect protein as part of it, and really highlight the health benefits, because I do think in its current state, at its current price level, it's too expensive to put inside a dog food on its own. I think because what ends up happening is that, because insect protein is so expensive, you end up putting less animal proteins in and more vegetable proteins in, and then you end up with a middle of the road product at a premium price. Whereas what we should have is as premium a product as possible, like as equivalent to the price as possible. But then that's not really viable as we currently stand with insect protein prices.
Well, obviously today we're not going to go into all the health benefits of insect protein, but that could be a whole series, a whole course that I could develop. But I would predict, if we, with these big companies, learn to utilize insect protein in pet food, it would displace tons of the supplement industry. And because that's a lot of, like you said, Me Too's out there. I do market intelligence, claims, ingredients. It's Me Too. Same manufacturers using the basic label. They may change one or two ingredients or the order or whatever, but there's nothing exciting going on besides a few companies doing stuff in different supplement areas. But I think you would displace the need for a lot of supplements if you learned how to use insect protein, because that lauric acid is going to come in at a cheaper rate than what we can if we isolate just lauric acid as its own medium chain fatty acid from a price point, and the fact that you said you're getting the protein value on top of that, right there, the value proposition is how, if I was selling insect meal to the pet market, that is how I would value it. Like you said, it's going to take companies to market not on sustainability or, you know, the novelty of insect protein, but on the benefits. And we use the humanization of dog food, and reason, you know, lauric acid does have a lot of benefits in humans, but so we don't get savvy enough on the pet food, educating our consumers on why we want to use these different ingredients. It's ultimately to help their pets. And I think you'll have a taste and texture perspective if you just do a full insect protein. I could be wrong. I haven't tested any of those out. But you know, I still think it's a value, like you said, a mixed protein.
Yeah. And I think that should be the main target for it. And I don't believe there's anybody in the US doing it. We have one company in the UK who make a fresh cooked food which uses insect protein as a constituent part, but they still market that side of it as sustainable rather than the health benefits. So although I like what they're doing, I don't like how they're marketing it. So it's kind of, you know, let's do things like, because again, I think the problem is that people forget why people buy things. You know, people buy based on pain points. You walk into a store and you say, I need to change my dog food because my dog, it's got problems with inflammation, it's got poor gut health, it's got bad skin, like, you know, it's got loads of allergies, it's, you know, whatever it is, they need an answer to that question. And by actually showing the benefits of insect protein in a particular product, I think, number one, it keeps under the price where it gets outrageous, but also, you know, it can also desensitize to people. Because if it was, you know, chicken and fish, or chicken and insect, or fish and insect, you could call it a latency or something like that, and then say, well, this has got the omega-3s and 6s from the, you know, from the fish, and then it's got the, you know, the medium chain fatty acids from the insect, and it becomes less of an ordeal for people rather than just insect protein, because it is very palatable as well, and so there's nothing wrong with it in that side, but it's just getting it to people, but in a format that makes sense and isn't insanely expensive or degrades the overall value of the product to the customer.
Well, wow. Yes, that's a good topic. I think we've covered it, but we're going to have you back. I think this will be a whole series on YouTube about insects and educating people. But I mean, I'm excited. I'm going to keep a watch out for it. I think based on this conversation, one of my action items for the audience and the people out there trying to get more information on what to feed their animals is, you know, what is food waste? And I've been pulled in a lot of those discussions as well, that people need to understand that agriculture uses a lot of food waste, but the food waste I think a lot of people are thinking of, we have regulations here, even in the US, that we can't utilize those products. And the best thing we can do is anaerobic digesters to recapture some of that. But a lot of it's still going into the landfills.
Yeah. And look, even if we could put it into insect production, it would create an inconsistent product, which would give us limited value streams for it. I mean, it would really limit us to the wild bird food market and some hobbyist markets which aren't nutrition based. So it's the harsh reality of it is that when we talk about food waste, we're talking about a very limited scope.
And I have formulated a lot with food waste, and it is not easy to grow animals on an inconsistent product. It just isn't. You know, I fed ketchup, for instance, mayonnaise 1 week, and then I get ice cream the next week, and formulating on whey and microbial protein off of pond scum, as I tell people in my career. And it's really hard to get you a nutritious protein and safe protein on your plate as a human when we have inconsistent waste flows coming our way to grow that protein for you, regardless if it's an insect that you choose to eat or a pig.
Yeah, no, and look, it's exactly the same with black soldier fly. because look, you need to, if you're producing at scale, you need to know how much food to put in, how long it's going to take to convert, because what you can't do is pull a batch out and then there's a load of like uneaten gunk at the bottom, because then that's not going to go through the sifting machines. It's a nightmare. Like, so unfortunately, the reality of industry, like when it comes to agricultural industry, is that consistency is super important, and that doesn't work on a level where we actually use a mixed barrel of waste.
Well, thank you so much, Clayton. This has been fun. I know I'll have you back on this Animystics educational YouTube content. So thank you.
Oh, it was great. Thanks a million.